Imagine this: you've worked your whole life, paid your dues, sacrificed birthdays and weekends, all for that promise, a safe retirement. But what if the day finally comes, and instead of security, you're staring at an empty bank account, rising bills, and the quiet terror of outliving your money? What if the system that was supposed to protect you was never built to last? Behind the curtain of America's prosperity lies a web of fragile pensions, underfunded programs, and shifting markets. Decisions made decades ago ripple into today, hidden forces shaping whether families thrive in old age, or break apart under the weight of uncertainty. The story of one family reveals this truth. Generation by generation, they lived through wars, recessions, booms, and crashes, always believing tomorrow would be safer. But with each era, the cracks grew wider, until the illusion of retirement security shattered. Economists warned about the math not adding up. Historians pointed to past collapses. Yet millions kept hoping. The contrast was stark: glossy brochures of golden years, versus the hidden reality of people running out of money, quietly selling homes, or returning to work at 70. This isn't just about savings, it's about dignity, independence, and the fragile line between stability and despair. Because when retirement collapses, it's not just numbers on a page, it's families torn between caring for parents, raising children, and trying not to sink themselves. And so we begin, with the Harpers, an ordinary American family, carrying extraordinary weight, as the clock ticks on the retirement time bomb America refuses to discuss. The story begins in 1949, in a quiet Midwestern town still recovering from the shadow of World War II. Factories that once churned out tanks and aircraft parts now made farm tools, washing machines, and automobiles. For families like the Harpers, this was the dawn of something new, a promise of stability that their parents had never known. Richard Harper, just 24, had returned from the war with a Purple Heart scar on his shoulder and a restless determination in his heart. His wife, Eleanor, was 21, practical yet hopeful, her hands calloused from factory work but her eyes lit with the dream of a small house with a white fence. In those years, America was rebuilding not just cities, but lives. The GI Bill opened doors for veterans like Richard, low-interest mortgages, education, the chance to escape the endless cycle of tenant farming that had bound their parents. They moved into a modest two-bedroom home built in a development that promised a fresh start for young families. The monthly mortgage payment? Just $56. And with that home came a job. Richard was hired at the local steel plant, a company that promised more than just a paycheck. It offered a pension, a word Richard had never spoken in his father's house. The idea that after decades of work, a company would guarantee income for life seemed almost too good to believe. But it was true. Across the nation, unions were strong, and pensions became bargaining chips. By 1950, nearly 25% of American workers had some form of retirement plan. For Richard and Eleanor, this meant they could imagine a future not of endless labor, but of rest, dignity, and time. The evenings in their home carried the warmth of possibility. Richard would return from long shifts, the smell of iron clinging to his clothes, and Eleanor would sit beside him at the kitchen table, balancing a small ledger of savings. "We'll make it," she would whisper, tracing numbers on the page. "If we just keep going, we'll be all right." But history has a way of weaving shadows into even the brightest rooms. Because while the Harpers built their life, larger forces stirred: economic cycles, political deals, global shifts that would test every assumption Americans held about security. The steel industry boomed in the 50s, but even then, the seeds of competition were being planted overseas. In Japan, in Germany, factories rebuilt with modern efficiency, ready to challenge America's dominance. Still, Richard didn't see that. Not yet. For now, his world was shifts at the mill, backyard barbecues, the hum of a radio broadcasting news of Korea and rock and roll. Their first son, David, was born in 1952, followed by Susan in 1956. The children grew up in a house filled with the steady rhythm of routine, a father working, a mother stretching every dollar, and a community that seemed stable. Yet stability has its price. Richard worked nights, weekends, sometimes double shifts when the plant demanded it. His back ached, his hands carried scars that never healed. But when he signed the annual union contract, the line about pensions was what mattered most. "This will carry us through," he told Eleanor. "When the kids are grown, when I'm too old to work, this will take care of us." What he didn't know, what no family in that town really knew, was how fragile those promises could be. By the early 1960s, whispers began to spread among the men in the plant. The pension fund, though guaranteed on paper, was not immune to mismanagement. Some companies underfunded their plans, betting on perpetual growth. Others dipped into reserves. Workers didn't see the numbers, they only saw signatures and stamps of approval. Trust was implicit. For the Harpers, trust was enough. They built their life brick by brick. David excelled in school, Susan grew into a bright girl who loved painting, and Eleanor finally managed to save enough to buy a second-hand piano for the children. The American dream seemed within reach, each note on that piano a reminder that sacrifice paid off. But sacrifice came at a cost. By 1967, Richard's health began to falter. Years of inhaling dust and smoke from the furnaces weakened his lungs. Eleanor noticed his cough deepened at night, his steps slowed on the walk home. Yet he pressed on, because the pension required 25 years of service before full benefits would vest. He was at year 18. And then came the strike. The union called it after contract negotiations broke down. For weeks, workers walked the line, their families surviving on savings, donations, and the thin hope of resolution. David, then 15, saw his father pacing at night, torn between loyalty to his brothers at the plant and the fear of losing what they had fought for. The strike ended after nearly 3 months, but the scars lingered. The company agreed to new terms, including modest pension protections, but trust was shaken. Richard returned to work, coughing harder than before, clutching his chest when no one was looking. In the Harper home, tension grew. Eleanor worried not only about his health but about the numbers on her ledger. Medical bills, college savings, mortgage payments, they stretched thin. And though the pension promise still glowed like a beacon in the distance, Eleanor whispered to herself at night, "What if it's not enough?" The question would echo across decades, through their children and grandchildren. Because what began in that small Midwestern home was not just a family story, but a reflection of a nation caught between promises and reality. And in the winter of 1971, as Richard walked home through falling snow, his breath ragged, the glow of the steel mill behind him, something happened that would change everything. The snow fell heavy that evening, muffling the town in silence. Richard Harper walked slowly, each step pressing into drifts that reached his ankles. His coat was worn, the lining thin, but he pulled it tight against the wind. The glow of the mill burned faintly in the distance, orange sparks leaping into the night sky, but Richard's chest was tighter than usual, his breath short and shallow. Neighbors would later recall seeing him pause beneath a street lamp, his figure hunched against the storm, one hand pressed firmly against his ribs. He never made it to the front door. By the time Eleanor found him collapsed on the porch, snow already gathering on his shoulders, his lips were blue. He survived, barely. The doctors at St. Mary's Hospital called it a minor heart attack, though Eleanor knew there was nothing minor about watching her husband nearly vanish in front of her. Richard was only 46. The doctors warned him plainly, slow down, reduce stress, avoid heavy labor. But how could he? He had 7 years left before his pension vested. Without those years, everything, the promise of a steady income, the hope of retirement, would vanish. So Richard returned to the mill, moving slower now, coughing more often. Eleanor begged him to stop. "We can find another way," she whispered in the dark of their bedroom, her hand resting on his chest. But Richard shook his head. "I've given everything to that plant," he said. "I won't walk away empty-handed." The children watched in silence. David, now in college on a scholarship, came home weekends to help with chores. Susan, in high school, saw her mother's eyes darken with worry. The once bright notes of the piano fell quiet. The Harper home, once filled with certainty, now carried an unspoken tension. Time was running out. And around them, the country was shifting. The early 1970s brought inflation that crept into every grocery bill. Gasoline prices soared after the oil crisis of 1973, and ordinary families like the Harpers felt the squeeze. Nationwide, workers depended more than ever on pensions to anchor them against the rising tide. By this time, nearly half of private sector workers had some form of pension coverage, but the cracks were widening. Reports surfaced of companies mismanaging funds, or worse, going bankrupt and leaving workers with nothing. The most infamous case was Studebaker, the car manufacturer in South Bend, Indiana. In 1963, just 8 years earlier, its pension collapse had shocked the nation. 11,000 workers suddenly discovered that decades of service meant almost nothing. Congress debated reforms, unions demanded guarantees, but progress was slow. For men like Richard, the memory of Studebaker was a warning, one he tried not to think about, even as his body reminded him daily of his fragility. Eleanor kept her own quiet records, clipping newspaper articles, saving every receipt, writing letters to her sister about her fears. "They tell us the pension is safe," she wrote in 1974, "but how can we be sure? What happens if Richard can't finish his years?" That same year, a flicker of hope emerged. The Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, was signed into law. It promised new protections, requiring companies to fund their pensions responsibly and creating insurance through the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. For the Harpers, it sounded like salvation. The union steward came to the plant floor, holding up pamphlets that declared, "Your retirement is safer than ever." Richard clung to that reassurance. He worked through pain, his knuckles swollen, his breath shallow, until finally, in 1978, he reached his 25-year mark. The pension was his. He signed the paperwork with trembling hands, Eleanor at his side, tears brimming in her eyes. For the first time in decades, they allowed themselves to dream, maybe, just maybe, they would see those golden years. But life rarely follows the script. In 1980, the steel industry began to collapse under global competition. Cheap imports flooded the market, mills shuttered, and entire towns withered. In Youngstown, in Gary, in Pittsburgh, families saw their livelihoods vanish overnight. The Harper plant cut shifts, then laid off hundreds. Richard was spared at first, seniority kept him on, but he watched as friends, men who had worked beside him for decades, carried their lunch pails home for the last time. David, now in his late 20s, saw it too. He had become a teacher, inspired by the belief that education could shield him from the factory's fate. He married young, his wife Linda working part-time as a nurse, and together they bought a small home in the same town. But even as he graded papers late into the night, he carried the weight of his father's struggle. He worried, if pensions could crumble for steelworkers, could they crumble for teachers too? Susan, meanwhile, pursued art in Chicago, living in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and long nights waiting tables. She carried less faith in institutions than her brother. Watching her father's health fail, seeing her mother's constant anxiety, convinced her that promises were fragile. "Paint what you see," she once told a friend, "and what I see is everyone pretending it'll all be fine, until it isn't." Back in the Harper home, Richard's condition worsened. Retirement arrived not with joy, but with urgency. He left the mill at 55, far earlier than planned, his body giving out before his spirit. The pension checks came, smaller than they had hoped, but steady enough to keep the lights on. Eleanor clipped coupons, stretched meals, and prayed every month that the money would last. It wasn't the retirement they had envisioned, but it was survival. And then came 1982. The recession hit hard. Unemployment soared to nearly 11%, the highest since the Great Depression. Inflation cooled, but interest rates were crushing. Families across America faced foreclosures, bankruptcies, despair. For retirees, the cost of living strained every dollar. Eleanor found herself calculating the price of groceries down to the penny, while Richard's medical bills piled higher. Their children pitched in when they could. David sent money quietly, not telling his wife how often their own bills went unpaid. Susan returned home for months at a time, selling paintings on the side, but often giving more comfort than cash. The Harpers had survived wars, strikes, and crises, but now the battle was quieter, fought not with picket lines but with ledgers and sacrifices. And beneath it all lay an unspoken truth: the pension might not be enough. In the winter of 1983, one cold evening, Eleanor opened a letter from the pension board. Her hands shook as she read the words. Adjustments. Funding shortfalls. Potential reductions. The same story that had haunted Studebaker 20 years before seemed to echo again. She sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling between her fingers, Richard asleep in the next room, his breath ragged. She whispered the words aloud, as though speaking them might make them less real: they can take it away. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that everything they had built, the house, the sacrifices, the dreams, balanced on a knife's edge. The storm outside rattled the windows, and she stared at the paper in her hands, wondering how she would tell her husband that the future they had clung to might already be slipping away. Eleanor sat frozen at the kitchen table, the yellow lamp buzzing faintly above her. The letter was brief, clinical in tone, and yet every word seemed heavy enough to crush her. Adjustments due to funding challenges, future benefits subject to review. It wasn't a cancellation, not yet, but the threat was clear. She tucked the letter back into its envelope before Richard woke. She couldn't bear to show him. His health was fragile, his pride still tied to those decades at the mill. To admit that the pension might falter was to admit that his life's work had been a wager against time. For weeks, she carried the weight alone, smiling through dinners, clipping coupons more aggressively, stretching the same stew across 3 nights. But secrets don't stay buried. David noticed first. He came home one weekend with his wife Linda and their newborn son, Michael. As Eleanor held the baby, trying to focus on joy, David saw the worry etched into her face. That night, as she folded laundry in the dim back room, he pressed her. "Mom, what's wrong?" She tried to deflect, but eventually she pulled the letter from a drawer, handing it to him without a word. David read it twice, his jaw tightening. He understood immediately: the pension was not the safety net they had all believed it to be. He thought of his father lying in the next room, unaware, and felt anger rise in his chest. "They promised," he muttered. "They can't just take it back." But history showed otherwise. Across the country, pensions were being restructured, adjusted, or quietly underfunded. While ERISA had offered protections, it had not prevented loopholes or underperformance. And when companies struggled, workers and retirees bore the cost. The Harpers were not alone. In Pennsylvania, retired miners protested cuts that left them choosing between heating their homes and buying medicine. In Detroit, auto workers gathered in union halls, listening as lawyers explained why their pensions might shrink. The headlines rarely reached front pages, but in kitchens and backyards across America, families whispered the same fear: what if it all disappears? David returned to his teaching job that week, but the unease stayed with him. He looked at his own pay stubs differently. His district offered a pension too, but would it hold? In the late 1980s, whispers of underfunding began to surface in state systems as well. Politicians assured teachers their retirements were safe, but David knew better than to trust blindly. He began saving extra in a small individual retirement account, a concept still unfamiliar to many of his colleagues. It wasn't much, but it was his hedge against a future that looked increasingly uncertain. Meanwhile, Susan's path diverged even further. After years of scraping by in Chicago, she returned home permanently, bringing with her a portfolio of art but little income. She took a job at a local bookstore, her creative dreams colliding with financial necessity. Watching her parents struggle, she concluded that traditional systems were traps. "I'll never rely on anyone else for retirement," she told friends. "If I make it, I'll make it on my own." Her art grew darker, canvases filled with images of crumbling buildings and hollow-eyed figures clutching empty wallets. Few sold, but those who did buy often remarked on their haunting truth. Through it all, Eleanor tried to hold the family together. She never let Richard see the full weight of their precarious position. He continued to cash his pension checks each month, unaware of the threat hanging over them, proud that he had taken care of his family. To strip that pride away would be crueler than any financial blow. So Eleanor carried the burden in silence. The 1980s pressed on. Ronald Reagan's America was one of contradictions: booming stock markets, rising consumer confidence, yet widening inequality. For those tied to pensions, the shift toward 401(k)s, new, portable retirement accounts, barely registered at first. But younger workers, like David's colleagues, began to notice the change. Companies preferred the flexibility of defined contribution plans, shifting risk from employer to employee. The pension era was slowly giving way to something far more uncertain. David straddled both worlds. He paid into his teacher's pension, but he also contributed small amounts to his IRA, aware that self-reliance might one day be the only option. He and Linda welcomed a second child, a daughter named Emily, and the weight of providing for 2 children while helping his parents quietly gnawed at him. In the Harper home, nights grew quieter. Richard spent hours in his recliner, the TV glowing with images of Wall Street traders and political speeches. His body weakened, his cough deepened, but his pride remained intact. Eleanor sometimes sat beside him, the letter still hidden in her drawer, wondering if she had done the right thing by shielding him. And then, in 1987, the stock market crashed. Black Monday, they called it. In a single day, the Dow Jones fell 22%, the largest one-day drop in history. For pension funds tied to markets, the losses were staggering. Newspapers ran stories of panic, of workers fearing their retirements had evaporated overnight. Eleanor didn't tell Richard about that either. She clipped the articles, folded them neatly, and tucked them away. But the fear spread through her like a fever. Each pension check that arrived felt less like stability and more like a reprieve from inevitable collapse. Susan, watching it all, grew bitter. "They build us up on promises they can't keep," she told David during a family dinner. "And we keep believing them." David, exhausted from teaching and raising children, sighed. "What choice do we have?" The room fell silent. Because beneath their words lay a truth they could not ignore: choice was shrinking. In 1989, Richard's health failed for the last time. He passed quietly in his sleep, Eleanor by his side. At his funeral, men from the mill stood in heavy coats, caps in hand, their faces lined with years of labor. They spoke of Richard's loyalty, his endurance, his pride in his pension. Eleanor listened, nodding, never revealing the hidden cracks beneath that story. Afterward, she returned to an empty house. The pension checks kept coming, now reduced to survivor benefits, smaller still but enough to scrape by. Yet the letter in her drawer reminded her every day, it could all change in an instant. And as she sat alone one evening, sorting bills by lamplight, she heard the phone ring. It was David. His voice was urgent, strained. "Mom, something's happening with the state teacher's pension. They're talking about cuts. I don't know what it means yet, but..." The line crackled. Eleanor gripped the receiver tighter, her pulse quickening. Another pension. Another promise in jeopardy. And for the Harpers, the cycle was beginning again. Eleanor held the receiver tightly against her ear, her knuckles whitening as David's voice flickered through the static. He spoke quickly, his words tumbling over one another, but the message was clear: the very pension he had been counting on was now uncertain. For Eleanor, the news reopened every wound. The letter she had hidden from Richard years earlier, the clipped articles about collapsing funds, the haunting memory of Studebaker, they all rushed back. She sat in silence as David explained that state legislators were warning of shortfalls, that promised benefits might be adjusted, that teachers across the district were worried. "I thought public pensions were safe," David said, his voice heavy. "They told us they were guaranteed by the state." But now, he trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Don't give up hope yet," she whispered, though her own hope had long since withered. By the early 1990s, public pension funds across America were under pressure. Years of generous promises, combined with underfunding and economic downturns, had left many systems vulnerable. Teachers, firefighters, police officers, workers who had dedicated decades of service, suddenly faced the possibility that their retirements might not be as secure as they believed. David felt the weight immediately. He and Linda had 2 children to raise, a mortgage to pay, and now the creeping realization that their future security was tied to political decisions far beyond their control. He began attending union meetings, listening as representatives tried to calm fears, citing actuarial reports and legal protections. But the language felt eerily familiar, the same reassurances his father's union had once given, before layoffs and cuts swept through the mill. At night, David found himself staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his children breathing down the hall. Michael was a teenager now, Emily still in middle school, both full of dreams that stretched beyond their small town. And yet he wondered, would his own sacrifices mean anything if the pension failed? Would he end up like his father, clinging to a promise that dissolved in his hands? Linda noticed his growing anxiety. She worked extra shifts at the hospital, saving what little they could. "We'll get through it," she said gently, placing her hand on his arm as they sat at the kitchen table late at night. But David shook his head. "I'm not sure we will." Meanwhile, Susan carved her own path. She had moved to Detroit in the late 80s, chasing opportunity in a city that pulsed with both creativity and decline. She painted murals on abandoned buildings, capturing the decay and resilience of communities left behind by industry. Her art earned recognition, but little money. She lived frugally, often sending small checks home to help her mother, but never enough to make a real difference. Eleanor, now in her 60s, aged quickly under the strain. The survivor's pension kept her afloat, but inflation gnawed away at every dollar. The cost of groceries, medicine, and heating oil outpaced her checks. She sold her piano, the one she had saved for decades earlier, tears in her eyes as movers carried it out of the house. "It's just a thing," she told Susan, who had come home to help. But the silence left behind was a wound. And then came 1994, when Congress approved changes to Social Security. Though benefits were not immediately cut, the reforms raised retirement ages and quietly signaled that even the most sacred promise in American life could shift under economic pressure. For Eleanor, the message was chilling. For David, it was another reminder that no system was truly unshakable. Yet life pushed forward. Michael graduated high school in 1995, accepted into a university on the East Coast. The family celebrated, though David worried how they would afford tuition. Student loans became part of the plan, a debt that stretched like a shadow over their future. Emily followed 3 years later, pursuing nursing like her mother. Through it all, David's pension remained uncertain. Some years the report sounded hopeful, other years grim. Each election brought new promises, new reassurances, but little clarity. He began to save aggressively in his IRA, teaching himself about mutual funds, diversification, and the shifting landscape of retirement planning. But he knew he was already late. Linda watched as the stress wore him down. His once thick hair thinned, his eyes carried permanent lines, his laughter grew rare. Still, he pressed on, convinced that if he worked long enough, saved hard enough, and held on to the pension, his children would have a chance at a better life. Eleanor, meanwhile, began to decline. By the late 1990s, arthritis twisted her hands, her body slowed, and her memory faltered. Susan moved back once again to care for her, putting her own art on hold. The sisters who visited from time to time noticed the toll. "She's carrying too much," they whispered. But Eleanor never spoke of the letter, never admitted that her silence had been a choice that defined them all. By 2000, the new millennium, the Harpers had lived through 50 years of promises and fears, of pensions that held and pensions that cracked. David looked at his own children, Michael now working in finance, Emily in nursing school, and wondered if their futures would be any different. And then the market crashed again. The dot-com bubble burst, sending portfolios plunging. Pension funds tied to equities suffered steep losses, and whispers of cuts resurfaced. In kitchens across the country, retirees stared at shrinking balances, while younger workers questioned whether pensions were worth anything at all. David felt it acutely. His IRA, modest but carefully built, lost a third of its value in months. His pension board issued cautious statements, warning of temporary volatility, but offering little reassurance. Michael, fresh out of college, saw his first job offers vanish as companies froze hiring. Emily, just beginning her career, watched nurses laid off as hospitals tightened budgets. At home, Eleanor grew weaker. One evening, as Susan spooned soup into her trembling hands, Eleanor whispered something unexpected. "There's a letter, in the drawer by the bed. Don't let David see it until I'm gone." Susan frowned, but said nothing. That night, curiosity pulled her to the drawer. Inside, folded neatly, was the decades-old letter from 1983, the warning that Richard's pension was at risk. Susan sat in silence, the paper trembling in her hands, understanding for the first time the quiet weight her mother had carried all these years. But why hide it? Why let Richard die believing the pension was solid? Why let David shoulder his own fears without knowing how fragile it had always been? Susan put the letter back, but the questions burned in her mind. 2 months later, Eleanor passed in her sleep, her body finally giving way to years of strain. At her funeral, David spoke of her strength, her sacrifice, her unyielding devotion to family. Susan said nothing about the letter. Not yet. Because something inside her told her that revealing it now could shatter everything David believed about his parents, about the sacrifices they had made, about the meaning of loyalty itself. And so, the secret remained hidden, until a moment came, years later, when the truth would force itself into the open, tearing at the Harper family once again. The new century brought with it both hope and unease. For the Harper family, Eleanor's passing left a silence that no one could quite fill. Her home, once warm with the smell of Sunday roasts and the steady clatter of dishes, now felt hollow. Susan stayed for a time, sorting through drawers and boxes, deciding what to keep and what to let go. The old letter remained hidden, folded neatly where Eleanor had left it. David, meanwhile, returned to his routines, teaching, coaching after-school programs, saving every spare dollar. His pension remained a source of constant debate at union meetings. Some experts said the system was stable, others warned of looming shortfalls. At night, he would sit at the kitchen table with Linda, flipping through statements. "It's like a storm cloud that never leaves," he muttered once. She didn't argue. By 2001, the storm took a new shape. The September 11th attacks shook the nation, casting uncertainty not just on security but on the economy. Markets plunged, pensions lost billions, and America entered a new era defined by both fear and resilience. For workers like David, retirement felt even more precarious. Michael, now in his mid-20s, worked in finance in New York. He was in the city on the day of the attacks, walking to work when the plane struck. For hours, his family waited, frantic, until his call finally came. "I'm safe. I'm all right." The relief was overwhelming, but the experience scarred him. He returned to work weeks later with a new awareness of how fragile life, and systems, really were. Emily, studying nursing, threw herself into her training, convinced that caring for others was the most stable path forward. Yet even hospitals, she learned, depended on pensions and funds that now looked shaky. Some older nurses delayed retirement, fearful of losses. Emily saw the stress etched into their faces, realizing that her future might carry the same weight. Back in Detroit, Susan painted obsessively. Her canvases grew darker, filled with images of crumbling towers, broken clocks, and faceless crowds. Critics called her work eerily prophetic, but sales remained sporadic. She lived simply, often mailing her siblings envelopes with $50 or $100 tucked inside. For groceries, she'd write, never admitting how little she had for herself. The early 2000s turned into a decade of turbulence. The wars overseas drained resources, while at home, corporations increasingly shifted from pensions to 401(k)s. By 2005, only a small fraction of private workers still had traditional pensions. Younger Harpers, like Michael and Emily, entered adulthood in a world where retirement meant personal responsibility rather than company promises. David felt the contrast sharply. He had grown up believing in the pension as a sacred guarantee, yet he now advised his children to save independently. "Don't trust the system," he told them over dinner one evening. "Build your own safety net." His voice carried the weight of both wisdom and resignation. Linda, still working nights at the hospital, nodded in agreement. She had seen too many colleagues return to work after retirement, forced back by rising medical bills and shrinking checks. "Nothing is safe anymore," she said quietly, sipping her coffee. The crash of 2008 proved her right. Lehman Brothers collapsed, banks failed, and the global financial system teetered on the edge. The stock market fell nearly 40%, and pension funds suffered catastrophic losses. David, approaching his 60s, saw his IRA nearly cut in half. His pension board issued grim reports, warning of unfunded liabilities and possible benefit reductions. Michael, working in finance, was laid off in the chaos. He packed his small apartment into boxes, moving back temporarily with his parents. The once confident young man returned hollow-eyed, carrying the weight of failure that wasn't his fault. "Everything I thought I knew about stability is gone," he admitted one night to Emily, who had just started her first nursing job. For Susan, the crash confirmed everything she had long believed. She painted furiously, her canvases filled with broken dollar bills, empty factories, and families huddled in dark rooms. One piece, the last check, depicted an elderly couple staring at a slip of paper with wide, fearful eyes. It was her most haunting work yet, and when it sold to a gallery in Chicago, it gave her enough money to pay off lingering debts. But success felt hollow. "I'm just painting the truth," she told the curator. And the truth is bleak. David, now nearing retirement age, faced a decision. Should he stay in the classroom longer, hoping the pension stabilized, or retire early to salvage what he could? Linda urged him to keep working. "We'll manage," she said. But if you stop now, it'll be less for the rest of our lives. David agreed, but the strain grew heavier with each passing year. One winter evening in 2009, Susan finally revealed the letter. She handed it to David as they sat at the dining table, the house quiet except for the hum of the furnace. "This is what Mom hid from you," she said softly. David unfolded the paper, his hands trembling. He read it once, then again, his face tightening with each line. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a mix of anger, grief, and betrayal. "She knew," he whispered. "All those years, she knew." Susan tried to explain, to defend Eleanor's choice, but David shook his head. "She carried it alone while I kept believing. I thought Dad's pension was solid. I thought ours could be, too. But it was a lie." The silence between them was heavy, almost unbearable. For the first time, David questioned not just the system, but his own family's choices. And as the decade closed, with millions of Americans losing homes, jobs, and retirements, David Harper sat at his table, staring at the old letter, realizing that his own golden years might never come. Because just as he began to plan for retirement, new reports arrived. His state's teacher pension fund was more than $30 billion in debt. And whispers spread that benefits would be cut. The winter of 2010 was bitter in Detroit, the kind of cold that seeps into bones and lingers even after you step inside. David Harper sat at his kitchen table most nights, a stack of pension reports and union newsletters spread out like battlefield maps. His hands shook as he underlined passages, circled figures, wrote questions in the margins. "$30 billion in debt," he whispered one night. "That's not just numbers, that's people's lives." Linda watched him, worry deepening the lines on her face. She had worked nights at the hospital for more than 30 years, her body weary but her mind still sharp. She knew what he feared, though he rarely said it aloud. If the pension collapsed, decades of work could unravel in an instant. Emily noticed the tension when she visited on weekends. As a young nurse herself, she was already paying into a retirement system that looked nothing like her father's. "It's all 401(k)s now," she told him one night over dinner. "No guarantees. No safety net." David sighed, realizing the generational shift wasn't just happening, it had already happened. Michael, still recovering from the crash of 2008, tried to rebuild. He found another job in finance, but his faith in the system was gone. "It's like playing poker in a casino that always wins," he said. "You might get lucky, but in the end, the house takes everything." For Susan, the crisis had become inspiration. Her paintings grew more pointed, filled with crumbling bank towers, faceless suits counting piles of cash, elderly figures fading into shadows. Critics said she captured the psychological toll of collapse. Yet she still lived modestly, her canvases stacked against the walls of her small studio. But for David, reality could not be painted away. Union meetings grew heated, with older teachers demanding answers. "We gave our lives to these schools," one shouted. "And now they're telling us there's nothing left." Others pleaded for calm, reminding everyone that reforms were being discussed. But behind closed doors, rumors spread, benefits cut, retirement ages pushed higher, cost of living adjustments frozen. It wasn't just Michigan. Across the country, pension shortfalls made headlines. In Illinois, funding gaps ballooned into the tens of billions. In California, public employees protested against reforms they said would gut their promises. Economists appeared on television, warning of a retirement time bomb that could destabilize entire states. David watched these reports with grim recognition. "We're living it," he muttered. "We're the example." At home, Linda urged him to think practically. "We can downsize," she suggested. "Sell the house, move somewhere smaller." David resisted at first. This house had been their anchor, the place where their children grew up, where Eleanor once baked pies on Sunday afternoons. But as heating bills rose and property taxes climbed, the idea no longer seemed unthinkable. Emily worried about them constantly. Her own job as a nurse was demanding, her shifts long and often heartbreaking. She saw elderly patients who had delayed care because they couldn't afford it, their savings drained by medical bills. She wondered if her parents would someday face the same fate. Michael, too, felt the weight of responsibility. He sent money when he could, but his own finances were shaky. The crash had left him scarred, cautious, and unwilling to gamble with stocks the way he once had. "I just don't trust it anymore," he confessed to Susan during one of their rare sibling phone calls. Susan listened quietly, then said, maybe trust was always the illusion. By 2012, David had reached retirement age, but the decision tore at him. The pension board had announced adjustments, reduced benefits for future retirees, delayed cost of living increases. His colleagues debated endlessly. Some retired early to salvage what they could, others stayed on, hoping reforms would stabilize the fund. David walked the empty halls of his high school one evening after class, the echo of his footsteps loud against the linoleum. He paused outside his classroom, looking at the rows of desks, the chalkboard covered with equations. For more than 30 years, this had been his world. Could he really leave it behind? At home, Linda pressed him gently. "You've done enough," she said. "You deserve to rest." But David shook his head. Rest doesn't pay the bills. Meanwhile, Susan prepared for an exhibit in Chicago. Her piece, The Vanishing Promise, a towering canvas showing pension checks dissolving into smoke, was gaining attention. Critics hailed it as her masterpiece, but Susan felt uneasy. The more recognition she received, the more she feared she was simply profiting off collective despair. Michael came to see the exhibit, standing in silence before the massive canvas. When Susan asked what he thought, he said quietly, "It's not just art. It's our lives." The family gathered that summer for a reunion, the first since Eleanor's funeral. They ate together in the backyard, laughter mixing with heavier conversations. David tried to hide his worry, but Emily saw through him. Late that night, sitting on the porch, she asked, "Dad, what if they cut it all? What if there's nothing left?" David didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the dark yard, the fireflies flickering like sparks of fleeting light. Finally, he said, "Then we start over. Somehow, we start over." But starting over at 65 is not the same as starting at 25. As the reunion ended, Susan pulled Emily aside. She confessed about the letter, the one Eleanor had hidden, the one David now carried like a weight in his pocket. Emily's eyes widened as Susan explained. Grandpa's pension collapsed. Grandma knew but stayed silent. Dad only found out after she died. Emily was stunned. "He's been carrying that this whole time?" Susan nodded. "And now he's afraid history is repeating." That fall, new reports confirmed his fear. Michigan's teacher pension fund, despite reforms, remained deeply underfunded. Economists warned it could run dry within a decade if drastic changes weren't made. David sat at his kitchen table, the same spot where his father once studied bills, the same spot where he had opened Eleanor's hidden letter. He looked at his own pension statement, the numbers shrinking with each adjustment. And for the first time, he allowed himself to whisper what he had never dared before. "What if I can't retire at all?" The question hung in the quiet of the Harper kitchen long after David spoke it aloud. Linda heard it, though he hadn't meant for her to. She stood in the doorway, her robe tied loosely, her eyes soft with worry. "You've given your whole life to teaching," she said gently. "If you can't retire, what does that say about the system we built everything on?" David didn't answer. He stared at the papers spread across the table, the pension statements, the union newsletters, the warnings from economists. Numbers blurred into one another. Years of savings felt suddenly insignificant, like trying to dam a river with pebbles. In 2013, Detroit filed for bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. The news shook the Harpers to their core. Headlines blared that pensions would be on the chopping block. Retirees gathered downtown, carrying signs, chanting, demanding that the promises made to them be kept. Some broke down in tears on live television. David and Linda watched together from their living room. "It's happening here," Linda whispered. "Right here." For David, it wasn't abstract anymore. It was his city, his colleagues, his future. The pension he had clung to was suddenly at the mercy of judges and lawyers. He thought of Eleanor hiding the truth about James's pension collapse, and for the first time, he understood her silence. How do you tell your children that the ground beneath them is crumbling? Emily, busy with double shifts at the hospital, caught glimpses of the coverage on break-room TVs. Many of her older patients were retired auto workers or public employees, living on pensions now frozen or cut. She saw the despair in their eyes, the confusion on their faces when medical bills outpaced their shrinking income. "I thought I'd be safe," one elderly man whispered to her as she adjusted his four. "I thought I'd made it." Michael, still rebuilding after the financial crisis, called his parents often. "Sell the house," he urged. "Free yourselves while you can." But David resisted. "This house isn't just wood and nails," he said. "It's history. It's all we have left that feels certain." Susan, meanwhile, poured the city's collapse onto canvas. She painted empty skyscrapers with broken windows, figures wandering streets with signs reading "Promise me something." Critics said her Detroit exhibit was her most powerful work yet. But for Susan, the praise felt hollow. "I'm painting our downfall," she told one interviewer. "And I'm part of it too." As the bankruptcy proceedings dragged on, rumors swirled about pension cuts as high as 30%. David attended union meetings packed with anxious teachers, many of them already retired and fearful of losing everything. "We fought wars, we built cars, we taught kids, and this is how they repay us," one retiree shouted, voice cracking. When the ruling finally came in 2014, pensions were cut, but less than expected. For Detroit retirees, it was still a blow, but many called it a grand bargain. The city was saved from total collapse, but the scars remained. David ran the numbers again and again. With the reduction, he and Linda could just barely make ends meet, if nothing went wrong. But something always went wrong. That same year, Linda fell ill. Years of night shifts and stress had taken their toll. She was diagnosed with a chronic condition requiring expensive medication. Insurance covered part of it, but co-pays mounted. David's pension check seemed to shrink as medical bills grew taller. He began tutoring in the evenings, not for passion, but for survival. Emily tried to help, sending money when she could, but nursing didn't pay much. Michael, working long hours in finance again, contributed too, but guilt gnawed at him. He had once believed money was endless, numbers on screens always rising. Now, every dollar felt fragile, temporary. One evening, David visited Susan in her studio. He watched her work in silence for a long time, then said, "You were right. About everything." Susan put down her brush. "Right about what?" "That it was all an illusion. We thought pensions meant security. We thought the system was unbreakable. But it was always broken. We just didn't want to see it." Susan studied her brother's face, worn and tired, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It wasn't wrong to believe. It was human. But now you have to decide, do you keep fighting for the promise, or do you let it go?" The question lingered in David's mind for months. Should he retire fully, accept the reduced pension, and hope it was enough? Or should he keep working, clinging to a shrinking paycheck? The decision weighed heavier when Linda's health worsened. The hospital bills piled higher, and the medications grew more expensive. David felt the walls closing in. His retirement dream had shrunk from travel and comfort to mere survival. At night, he thought of his father, James, staring at empty pay stubs decades earlier. He thought of Eleanor, keeping secrets to protect her children. And he wondered what legacy he would leave his own family. Emily noticed the change in him when she visited. "You look so tired, Dad," she said softly. "Maybe it's time to stop." But David shook his head. "If I stop, we fall." That winter, Michael brought home financial reports, trying to convince his father to move his savings into safer investments. "Diversify what's left," he urged. "Don't trust just the pension." But David's response was heavy with defeat. There isn't enough left to diversify. Susan's art continued to gain attention, yet her success was shadowed by guilt. She could sell a canvas for thousands, but she lived frugally, almost ascetically. At one gallery opening, a wealthy collector praised her for capturing the American decline. Susan smiled thinly, thinking, "You can hang our suffering on your wall, but you'll never feel it." By 2015, David made his choice. He filed for retirement, accepting the reduced pension. The first check arrived that spring. He held it in his hands, staring at the number, smaller than he had imagined, smaller than he had feared. Linda touched his arm. "We'll make it work," she whispered. But even as she said it, both of them knew survival would be fragile. And that summer, as David finally stepped away from the classroom, the news broke of another looming crisis. Public pensions across the nation, including Michigan's, were still massively underfunded, with projections showing deeper cuts ahead. David folded the newspaper, his chest heavy, his hands trembling. For the first time, he realized, retirement wasn't an ending. It was another kind of fight. And as he turned to Linda, her cough worsening, the phone rang. It was Emily, her voice tight with urgency. "Dad," she said. "Something's happened at the hospital. You need to come right away." The phone slipped slightly in David's damp palm as Emily's voice came through, urgent but controlled. "Dad, it's Mom. She collapsed at home. They brought her in. You need to come right away." For a moment, David couldn't move. His chest tightened, the air around him felt too thin. Linda, his anchor, his partner through every storm, was lying in a hospital bed, and he was still sitting at the kitchen table. He forced himself to stand, grabbed his coat, and rushed into the night. The drive blurred past him. Streetlights flickered, snow flurries whipped against the windshield, but his mind saw only fragments: Linda laughing in their backyard, holding newborn Emily, whispering reassurances when bills piled too high. By the time he arrived at the hospital, his legs trembled beneath him. Emily met him in the hallway, her scrub stained, her eyes red. "She's stable now," she said, gripping his arm tightly. But it was close. David entered the room slowly. Linda lay pale beneath the fluorescent lights, oxygen tubes snaking across her face. Machines beeped steadily, reminders that her life was tethered to fragile technology. When her eyes fluttered open, she tried to smile. "Don't look so scared," she whispered. "I'm not leaving yet." But David could see the truth. Years of night shifts, stress, and sacrifice had worn her body thin. He sat beside her, holding her hand, silently promising himself he wouldn't fail her. The doctor spoke in measured tones. Linda's condition required ongoing treatment, regular hospital visits, expensive medication. Insurance covered part of it, but the out-of-pocket costs were staggering. David's pension, already smaller than expected, would not stretch far enough. He knew it. Emily knew it. Linda knew it. Michael flew in from New York as soon as he heard. He arrived at the hospital still in his suit, exhaustion etched into his face. He hugged his father hard, then stood quietly by Linda's bed. Later, in the cafeteria, he said to Emily, "We have to find a way. If the pension won't cover it, we'll cover it." Emily shook her head. "We're not rich, Michael. We can't fix this alone. But we can't let them drown either," he shot back. His voice cracked under the weight of guilt. He had chosen a career in finance, a world that profited even as families like his own suffered. The irony cut deep. Susan arrived a day later, carrying a sketchbook instead of flowers. She sat by Linda's bed, sketching her as she slept. "It's how I cope," she whispered to David when he asked. "I capture her strength, even when she looks weak." The family crowded into the small hospital room, memories spilling out in hushed conversations. Stories of childhood, of Eleanor's kitchen, of James's laughter, all mixed with the sterile beeps of machines. But beneath the nostalgia ran a current of fear. How long could they keep Linda's treatment going? How long before money ran out? Outside the hospital, the broader crisis deepened. News outlets reported that America's retirement system was fracturing. Social Security faced long-term shortfalls, pensions were underfunded, and nearly half of Americans approaching retirement had no savings at all. Analysts warned that a generation was walking into old age with little more than hope. David absorbed these headlines with grim recognition. They weren't statistics to him, they were personal. He thought of colleagues forced to take part-time jobs, of neighbors selling their homes, of Linda hooked up to machines that cost more each month than their mortgage ever had. One night, unable to sleep, David wandered the hospital corridors. He found an older man sitting alone, staring at a stack of bills. They struck up a conversation. The man, a retired factory worker, had seen his pension slashed in half during the recession. Now, his wife lay dying in intensive care, and he didn't know how he would pay for her treatment. David listened silently, realizing their stories were the same, just different names, different industries. A lifetime of work, followed by betrayal. Promises broken, futures stolen. When Linda was finally discharged, David brought her home to the familiar creak of their front door and the warmth of their old living room. But caring for her was no simple task. Medications, follow-up visits, special diets, each detail carried a price. Emily visited often, helping with medical routines, adjusting pillows, tracking prescriptions. Michael sent money whenever he could, but the demands of his job left him distant, guilty that he couldn't be there more. Susan painted furiously, channeling her fear into canvases of fragile bodies and flickering hospital lights. She sold some pieces, sending the proceeds straight to David. Despite the family's efforts, the strain showed. David began tutoring more, taking on extra students, often falling asleep over lesson plans at the kitchen table. His health faltered, aches in his back, sharp pains in his chest, but he pushed forward, determined not to let Linda see his weakness. In quiet moments, Linda tried to reassure him. "We'll be okay," she whispered one night as he tucked a blanket around her. But her eyes betrayed doubt. Emily saw it too. On one of her visits, she confronted her father. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this. You're not invincible." David shook his head. "If I stop, who takes care of her?" Emily's voice broke. "We all do. That's the point, we do it together." But David had carried the burden so long that sharing it felt impossible. Meanwhile, the pension fund sent another letter. Benefits would be frozen again, with no cost of living increases. David read it in silence, his face pale. "Every year, it shrinks," he murmured. "Every year, it's worth less." The letter went into the same drawer as Eleanor's hidden note about James. The two papers sat side by side, proof that history wasn't just repeating, it was echoing louder. One autumn evening, Susan brought a nearly finished painting to the house. It showed a man sitting at a kitchen table, papers spread out before him, his face weary but defiant. "It's you," she told David. "It's all of us." David stared at the canvas for a long time. "Then it's not finished," he said quietly. "Because the story isn't over." The family gathered for Thanksgiving that year, the first since Linda's collapse. The meal was modest, roast chicken instead of turkey, fewer side dishes, fewer guests. But the atmosphere was warm, filled with gratitude that Linda was still there, still smiling despite her frailty. As the evening wound down, Emily suggested a family photo. They gathered in the living room, arms wrapped around one another, the old house glowing with soft lamplight. For a brief moment, the weight lifted. But later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, David sat alone in the kitchen once again. He opened the drawer, pulled out both letters, and stared at them under the dim light. His father's collapse. His own shrinking pension. His wife's mounting bills. He pressed his hands to his face, whispering into the silence, "How much longer can we hold on?" And in that fragile moment, as if fate were listening, the phone rang again, this time not from Emily, but from the pension board. They wanted to speak with him immediately. David's hand hovered over the phone, the digits of the caller ID glowing like a warning. The pension board. Official. Serious. The voice on the other end was crisp, controlled, almost clinical. "Mr. Harper, thank you for taking the call," the representative began. "We need to discuss your retirement benefits. There have been recent developments you should be aware of." David gripped the receiver tighter, the chair beneath him creaking. "Developments?" he asked cautiously. "Yes," the voice said. "Due to ongoing shortfalls in the state pension fund, your benefits are subject to a reduction. The board is exploring options for partial disbursement, deferred payments, or temporary freezes." David felt the room tilt. Deferred payments? Reduced benefits? Temporary freezes? Words that might as well have been hammers, striking his carefully constructed life. I don't understand," he stammered. "I've been contributing my entire career. I've paid into this fund, trusted this system. How can this happen?" The representative was calm. "We understand your concerns. Unfortunately, actuarial reports show the fund is underfunded by nearly 40%. We're required to make adjustments to ensure solvency for all participants. This may affect your immediate disbursements." David sank back in his chair, breathing shallow, the weight of decades of labor pressing down on him. He thought of Linda, of her medication, of the tutoring and side work that barely covered bills. He thought of Michael and Emily, struggling to keep themselves afloat while supporting their parents. And he thought of Eleanor, the hidden letter, the secret her parents had carried so long ago. "It's happening again," he whispered into the phone. "History repeating itself." The representative continued, outlining technical details, but David barely heard them. He ended the call abruptly, his hands shaking. The kitchen seemed colder than before, the shadows stretching longer across the worn linoleum. Linda, hearing the commotion, appeared at the doorway. "David? What is it?" He held up the letter from the pension board, his face pale. "It's the pension," he said simply. "They're cutting benefits. They might freeze payments. They might defer disbursement." Linda's eyes widened. "But, how? How is this possible?" David shook his head. "We trusted the system. We believed in security. And now, it's gone." Emily arrived soon after, summoned by her father's frantic call. She took one look at the letter and immediately understood the gravity. Her hands trembled as she sat beside David. "We'll figure it out," she said, though even she wasn't certain how. Michael, flying in from New York once again, joined them. He laid his hands on the table. "This is systemic," he said. It's not just us. It's teachers, firefighters, state workers, everyone counting on pensions is in the same boat. Susan watched silently from the corner of the room, sketchbook open. She had been painting the collapse for years, documenting despair as if it were an art form. Now, it was no longer distant or symbolic, it was real, immediate, and personal. In the days that followed, David began a grueling schedule. He contacted financial advisors, attended meetings with union representatives, and sat through endless briefings at the pension board. Each session delivered the same unsettling message: the system was underfunded, and cuts were inevitable. Across the country, the ripple effects were already visible. News stories documented retirees losing homes, delaying medical care, or taking jobs they had expected to leave behind. Economists warned of a retirement crisis that threatened not just individuals, but entire communities. David tried to hold the family together, but tension simmered. Late-night conversations with Linda devolved into arguments about money, healthcare, and sacrifices. Michael and Emily struggled to support their parents while juggling their own lives. Susan, working from her studio, poured her anxiety onto canvas, capturing the quiet desperation in stark, haunting lines. Despite the chaos, David pressed on. He took on more tutoring, more evening classes, anything that could supplement income. He spent hours poring over pension statements, trying to calculate how long the reduced payments could last. Every month felt like a countdown, each bill a reminder of fragility. And yet, amid the uncertainty, moments of quiet resilience emerged. Linda adapted to her new routine, managing medications with precision. Emily reorganized the household finances, finding small efficiencies that stretched every dollar. Michael negotiated side contracts to bring extra funds home. But the cuts were relentless. The pension board announced a final adjustment, a 15% reduction across all benefits for retirees over 60. David's check, once the backbone of their household, shrank again. The remaining balance was sufficient for essentials, but luxuries, medical contingencies, and long-term plans vanished. The family met in the living room one evening, staring at the letter detailing the reduction. No one spoke at first. David's gaze rested on the folded paper, the same way he had once stared at Eleanor's hidden note. History, he realized, wasn't repeating exactly, it was echoing, louder, with a cruel insistence. Susan broke the silence. "We've survived worse," she said softly. "But surviving isn't enough anymore. We need a plan." David nodded, exhausted but determined. He knew survival alone would not restore their dignity. They needed strategy, foresight, and perhaps the courage to confront systems far larger than their own household. That night, as the family dispersed to their rooms, David sat alone at the kitchen table, the pension letters stacked before him. He thought of James Harper, Eleanor, and the generations who had trusted systems that failed them. He thought of Michael, Emily, and Linda, all depending on him to navigate this storm. And then, a knock at the door startled him. It was an unfamiliar man, dressed in a suit that carried authority. He held a small folder. "Mr. Harper," he asked. "I'm from the State Pension Oversight Committee. May I come in?" David's heart sank. This was no routine visit. The committee member stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "We've identified discrepancies," the man said, opening the folder. "Records suggest that some retirees may have been misinformed about their entitlements. We need full cooperation to audit your account." David swallowed hard. Misinformed?" The man nodded. "We're investigating potential violations that could affect not just your payments, but the entire system. Your cooperation is crucial. And, time is of the essence." David's stomach turned. The letter, the cuts, the board's phone call, none of it had prepared him for this. His family's security, already fraying, now rested on the outcome of an investigation he barely understood. As the man left with his folder, David sank back into his chair, staring at the papers on the table. Every number, every promise, every paycheck felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He thought of Eleanor and the secrets she had carried, of the generations who had trusted promises too fragile to keep, and realized that for the Harper family, the battle was far from over. And then his phone buzzed again, a notification from the state pension website. New alerts. Immediate action required. David picked it up, his hands trembling. Because the next decision would determine not just his retirement, but the future of everyone he loved. The notification blinked on David's phone like a warning light. Every message felt like a hammer striking his chest. Immediate action required, it read. He swiped, opening the portal, only to find a series of alerts detailing discrepancies, overdue forms, and pending audits. The language was bureaucratic, cold, and absolute. Each word carried the weight of authority, each number a potential catastrophe. Linda, now weaker after months of illness, watched him from the couch. Her hand rested lightly on his arm. David, what is it? He couldn't find the words. The Pension Oversight Committee had flagged issues in records across the state, discrepancies in contributions, miscalculations in interest, even potential errors in cost-of-living adjustments. The letters from the board, the reductions, the deferred payments, all of it now had to be verified under a microscope. Emily arrived shortly after, dropping her bag on the floor. She scanned the phone. "This is serious," she said. Her voice was tight, but her composure steadied David more than he realized. "We need to gather everything." Michael flew in from New York once more, arriving at the house with a folder of financial documents, statements, and correspondence he had collected over the past decade. He laid them out methodically on the dining table. "We're going to walk through this," he said. "Every year, every deposit, every statement." David's hands shook as he sorted through decades of paperwork. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like an archive of broken promises. Receipts from 1985, old pension statements from the early 90s, the letters Eleanor had hidden, everything became relevant. For hours, they worked in silence, occasionally pausing to clarify figures, cross-reference statements, or double-check dates. The process was exhausting, mentally and emotionally, each discovery raising more questions than it answered. Susan sat nearby, sketchbook open, documenting the hours in rapid, sharp strokes. Her drawings captured the tension in the room, David hunched over papers, Emily cross-referencing forms, Michael frowning at numbers, Linda quietly watching, frail but alert. The artwork felt like a reflection of the emotional gravity, the family's struggle becoming tangible through lines and shadows. By late evening, Michael leaned back. "There are irregularities," he said carefully. "Not huge, but enough to trigger this audit. Some interest wasn't credited properly. Some contributions weren't recorded. If the committee finds errors, it could affect your payments for months, maybe years." David rubbed his temples. "So, even what's left of the pension, it's not guaranteed?" Michael shook his head. "Nothing is guaranteed anymore. Not after the cuts, the freezes, and now this audit." Emily's voice softened. "We'll get through it. One step at a time." But even she didn't fully believe it. The next morning, David met with the Pension Oversight Committee in a cramped office downtown. The walls were bare, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Files were stacked in precarious towers, and officials moved with precise urgency. One of the auditors, a woman in her 40s, reviewed the files David had brought. "We'll need more documentation," she said, eyes scanning the numbers. W-2s, contribution statements, any correspondence regarding adjustments. If everything checks out, your payments can continue, but if discrepancies remain, it may result in further reductions. David nodded numbly. I understand. The following weeks became a blur of phone calls, document submissions, and tense consultations. Every time David thought he had completed a task, another requirement appeared. Each call from the oversight committee felt like walking a tightrope over a pit. At home, the family tried to maintain routines. Emily continued nursing, Michael worked long hours, Linda managed medications, and Susan painted. But the air was thick with tension, unspoken anxieties that clung to every conversation. One evening, David received another call from the committee. They had found additional discrepancies, this time in calculations from the early 2000s. He sank into his chair, realizing that the investigation was expanding, reaching further back than anyone had anticipated. This could take months, he murmured to Emily, who was sorting prescriptions at the counter. Months, maybe years. Emily placed a hand on his arm. We'll handle it together. Just like always. But David knew this wasn't just paperwork, it was a reckoning. Every misstep, every overlooked statement, every hidden letter from the past converged on him now. He thought of Eleanor again, of the secrets she carried, and realized that history wasn't just repeating, it was catching up. By 2016, the audit was in full swing. Pension officials requested verification of decades of contributions, interest, and payments. Each request unearthed old errors, small but compounding. David's pension checks were temporarily suspended until the verification was complete. The family felt the pressure acutely. Medical bills continued for Linda. Living expenses stretched the reduced pension. Even the tutoring and Michael's side contracts were insufficient to cover the mounting costs. Susan's paintings became more urgent, darker, a reflection of the relentless stress. She sold pieces wherever she could, sending proceeds home, but the money only alleviated the pressure slightly. One night, as David worked late into the evening, Emily joined him. She held a folder of documents. "Dad, this might help," she said. "I cross-checked everything from 1995 to 2005. Some errors might actually work in our favor." David felt a flicker of hope. "Show me," he said, scanning the pages. Indeed, some miscalculations from the past could be corrected, potentially increasing his current benefits. But the process would be slow, and there was no guarantee. The tension in the house was palpable. Each knock at the door, each phone call, carried potential disaster. Every family dinner ended with lingering conversations about finances, legal requirements, and the ever-present question, how long could they survive this relentless uncertainty? And then, one morning in late spring, an official letter arrived from the Oversight Committee. David held it in his hands as the room seemed to shrink. The envelope was thick, the paper crisp, the official seal heavy with authority. He unfolded it slowly. The letter detailed a partial restoration of benefits, but only after months of verification. Some payments would be retroactive, some adjustments required additional documentation, and the process could drag on indefinitely. David's chest tightened. It was relief, yes, but relief tempered with the realization that the battle was far from over. Every month, every day, was a fight to secure the future they had imagined decades ago. He looked at Linda, asleep in her chair, medications arranged on the side table. At that moment, the full weight of their situation struck him: the pension system, broken promises, hidden letters, decades of sacrifice, it had all converged here, in this small living room, in the fragile lives of the Harper family. And just as he exhaled, thinking perhaps they could endure, the phone rang again. This time, it was not from the Oversight Committee, nor from Emily or Michael. It was an unfamiliar number, local, unlisted, insistent. David hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Harper," a voice said, low and urgent. "We need to talk about the pension fund, before it's too late." David froze, the papers in his hand trembling. Because the next revelation would not just threaten his retirement, it would threaten the family's very survival. David held the phone to his ear, heart hammering. The voice on the line was calm, almost too calm, but every word carried urgency. Mr. Harper. I represent a private oversight group. There are irregularities in the state pension system you are not aware of. Potential embezzlement, misallocated funds, and systemic risk. Your account may be directly affected. David froze. I don't understand. Who are you? How do you know about my account? There was a pause. Then the voice said, the details are complex, and time is critical. You need to secure your records, your statements, everything, and, most importantly, be prepared for rapid developments. Your family's future is at risk. The line went dead. David sat motionless, staring at the receiver. His mind raced. Embezzlement? Misallocated funds? Systemic risk? He had thought the audit was the worst thing he'd face. Now, a hidden threat loomed, shadowy and undefined. He glanced at Linda, asleep in the chair, frail and fragile. He thought of Emily, Michael, Susan, each of them working tirelessly to preserve what little security remained. And he thought of the generations before him, Eleanor and James, the hidden letters and forgotten promises. This was bigger than a single audit. This was the system itself, crumbling beneath them. The next days blurred into chaos. David contacted Emily and Michael immediately. They gathered in the living room, papers and files spread out across the table. We've already verified decades of statements, David said, voice tight. Now there's this. He held up the receiver, recounting the anonymous call. Michael frowned, rubbing his eyes. This sounds serious. But how can it be verified? Who even makes these claims? Emily's voice was steady but tense. We need to assume it's real until proven otherwise. We've been lucky so far, but we can't take chances. Susan, pacing the studio, paused and turned toward them. This is what I've been painting all along, she said quietly. The collapse, the cracks, the hidden rot. Now it's not just metaphor. It's reality. David spent hours that night calling contacts, advisors, and even reporters who had covered pension mismanagement in the past. The picture that emerged was worse than he feared. Across the state, millions of dollars had been siphoned or mismanaged. Some funds had been shifted to risky investments, others misallocated entirely. This isn't a minor error, Michael said, running his fingers through his hair. It's systemic. If it goes uncorrected, the fund could fail completely. People will lose everything. And it's not just us, it's hundreds of thousands of retirees. Linda, ever perceptive despite her illness, spoke softly from the couch. Then we fight. We've fought for everything else. Why not this? David nodded, though the weight on his shoulders was immense. He began documenting every transaction, cross-referencing every statement. Emily and Michael assisted, their combined effort creating a paper trail that even the most seasoned auditor would find meticulous. Weeks passed. Meetings with pension officials, lawyers, and financial advisors became routine. Sleep was rare. Meals were rushed. The family lived in a constant state of alert. Even Susan's painting reflected the tension, sharp lines, jagged edges, and shadows stretching across canvases like the invisible fingers of a looming disaster. One evening, David received an email from an anonymous source claiming to have evidence of missing funds, detailing wire transfers and accounts that should not exist. The source requested discretion, warning that the people responsible for the mismanagement were powerful and would act to protect themselves. David printed the documents. The handwriting, numbers, and signatures suggested a sophisticated, long-term scheme. Funds intended for retirees had been funneled elsewhere, some lost to speculation, some diverted to cover unrelated liabilities. He stared at the pages, the same pages that could determine his family's survival. The irony was cruel: decades of careful work, trust in a system that promised stability, and now everything could collapse because of unseen forces manipulating the very foundation of the pension fund. Emily leaned over his shoulder. "We need to act fast," she said. "This can't wait. The longer we delay, the less chance we have." Michael nodded. "We should go public if necessary. Contact investigative reporters, state auditors, anyone who can force transparency. We can't just hope the board fixes this quietly." David swallowed hard. "Do we even know who to trust? If this goes wrong, it's not just our retirement. It's Linda, it's Susan, it's Emily, it's Michael. All of us." The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and planning. David and his children coordinated with legal counsel, preparing to bring the documents to state authorities and journalists. Every step was cautious, calculated, and nerve-wracking. Then, one morning, Susan discovered something alarming. One of her canvases, an unfinished depiction of a crumbling pension tower, had been broken into the studio. The papers she had been holding, preliminary sketches connecting her art to the systemic collapse, were gone. Fear gripped the family. The anonymous source's warnings suddenly felt tangible. Someone was watching. Someone was protecting the mismanagement at all costs. David, pacing the living room, whispered, "They know we're onto them. Everything we've done, they're watching." Emily placed a hand on his arm. "Then we move faster. Transparency is our shield now. The more light we shed, the harder it is for them to hide." Michael, already coordinating with a journalist who had broken pension scandals before, said, "We have proof. Enough to force an investigation. But we have to be careful. One misstep, and it could all be gone." The family worked tirelessly, every hour a gamble. Linda, though weak, offered quiet support. Susan painted feverishly, documenting the unfolding crisis, while Michael and Emily coordinated the legal and journalistic effort. One evening, David sat alone at the kitchen table, letters and documents spread around him, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. He realized that the pension system's failure was no longer theoretical. It was personal. It had been for decades, for generations, and now the full force of its consequences had descended upon them. And as he stared at the documents from the anonymous source, the realization hit him: uncovering the truth might save their family, but it could also put them in danger. Those who had manipulated the fund were powerful, determined, and unseen. David pressed his hands to his face, whispering to the empty room, "We've come too far to back down, but at what cost?" The house was quiet. Too quiet. And outside, the first sign of approaching winter cast long shadows across the Harper home. Because some battles, David knew, aren't won in months, or even years. They are fought against time itself. Winter settled over Detroit like a slow, steady weight. Snow drifted along the streets, muffling the city's noise, blanketing its struggles in temporary silence. Inside the Harper home, the family sat together in the living room, the hum of the space heaters filling the quiet gaps. The past months had tested them beyond measure. Audit meetings, pension letters, anonymous warnings, missing documents, it had been a relentless storm. But slowly, carefully, they began to piece together a path forward. David, working closely with legal counsel and investigative journalists, submitted the full documentation from the Oversight Committee and the anonymous source. The journalists, seasoned and thorough, verified the evidence and published a detailed exposé: mismanagement, misallocated funds, and potential embezzlement across the state pension system. The article drew immediate attention, prompting formal investigations at the state level. Michael coordinated with the reporters and legal teams, ensuring the Harper family's concerns were central to the unfolding inquiry. Emily assisted, meticulously cross-checking every detail, every number, every receipt. They were exhausted, but finally, the weight of secrecy and uncertainty lifted slightly. Linda, though still recovering from her chronic illness, followed the developments with cautious optimism. Her medications, still costly, were now partially covered by emergency state funds allocated to support families affected by pension mismanagement. For the first time in months, she felt a measure of security. Susan's paintings had become a visual chronicle of the crisis, each canvas capturing despair, resilience, and eventual hope. One piece, a towering image of a family standing firm amid crumbling towers labeled Pension Fund, won critical acclaim and was acquired by a museum. Susan insisted the proceeds be donated to local charities assisting retirees facing financial hardship. By early spring, the pension board issued statements acknowledging errors and promising corrective action. While some adjustments would take time, retroactive payments were restored, and safeguards were implemented to prevent further mismanagement. David's pension stabilized, reduced in past months but now secure enough to support the family without forcing extreme sacrifices. The Harper household began a cautious rebuilding. David continued tutoring, but no longer out of desperation, rather, as a purposeful choice to remain active in the community. Linda, strengthened by months of attentive care and recovery, regained her daily routine, attending checkups without fear of financial collapse. Emily and Michael resumed their lives with a renewed sense of agency. Emily advanced in her nursing career, drawing inspiration from her family's resilience and the lives of patients who, like them, depended on systems once considered infallible. Michael, more cautious and intentional, invested in projects that offered both ethical and financial stability, determined to avoid the blind trust in institutions that had cost his family so dearly. The family gathered one evening around the kitchen table, now tidy and calm. Papers and letters that had once felt like chains were neatly filed away, reminders of battles fought and survived. They shared stories and laughter, the weight of uncertainty replaced with a quiet confidence. David reflected on the generations before him, James, Eleanor, and the hidden lessons of trust and vigilance. They had been cautious, protective, but limited by the times they lived in. Now, David had taken those lessons, amplified them with the tools of the present, and secured a future for his children and grandchildren. Susan placed her hand on her brother's shoulder. "We survived," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of truth and relief. "Yes," David replied, glancing at each family member. "But more than survived, we learned. We stayed vigilant, we adapted, and we held together. That matters as much as any dollar or pension check." The city around them was still scarred, still in recovery, but the Harper home had become a microcosm of resilience. They had faced the systemic collapse of a trusted institution, navigated threats that had reached into the shadows, and emerged with both dignity and security intact. Linda, smiling faintly, reached for David's hand. "We'll never be naive again," she said. "But we'll never give up either." David nodded, the memory of the anonymous phone calls, missing documents, and months of uncertainty still vivid. "No," he said. "We won't. And we won't let the next generation face the same blind trust without understanding the risks." Emily and Michael shared a quiet glance, silently agreeing. They had witnessed the fragility of institutions, the human cost of mismanagement, and the strength required to confront it. Their parents' endurance had shown them that vigilance, collaboration, and courage could alter outcomes, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Susan stood and gestured to her most recent painting. "It's done," she said. "And this time, it's not just art, it's a reminder of what we faced, and what we overcame." The family gathered around the canvas. The figures, drawn with bold lines and shadows, stood united amid crumbling structures labeled debt, cuts, and fraud. Yet the Harper's image, at the center, was upright, connected, and unwavering. David felt a deep sense of closure. The battle was not over for every family in Detroit, for every retiree in the country, but for his family, they had reclaimed agency. They had navigated the collapse of a system, confronted hidden threats, and emerged with lessons etched into their lives. That night, as the snow fell softly outside, the family sat together in quiet companionship. No letters, no calls, no looming audits, just the warmth of shared history, resilience, and mutual care. David thought of the journey they had traveled. From Eleanor's hidden letters to Linda's hospitalization, from reduced pension checks to urgent warnings of systemic corruption, each moment had tested their endurance. And yet, here they were, intact, aware, and prepared for the future, not with naive hope, but with informed determination. For the first time in decades, the Harper family could imagine life without constant dread, without the specter of financial collapse dictating every choice. They had survived the retirement time bomb, not untouched, not unscarred, but unbroken. And as they sat together, the lights dimmed, and the warmth of their home enveloped them, David realized the truth: survival was never passive. It was deliberate, relentless, and bound by the ties that held a family together through every trial, every uncertainty, every challenge. For the Harpers, and the generations yet to come, vigilance, love, and unity would be their inheritance, stronger than any pension, safer than any promise, enduring far beyond the instability of systems and the fragility of institutions. They had faced the collapse and endured. And in that endurance, they found hope. The snow fell gently over Detroit, softening the harsh edges of a city that had endured decades of turmoil. Streets once bustling with industry now whispered of abandoned factories and faded promises, yet life persisted, quietly, stubbornly, like a pulse beneath the ruins. Inside the Harper home, the warmth of lamps and laughter contrasted the chill outside. The family, bound by trials, had emerged from uncertainty not unscathed, but stronger, aware of the fragility of systems they had once taken for granted. Their story was one of perseverance, vigilance, and the quiet power of unity in the face of forces far larger than any individual. Across the nation, millions still faced a precarious retirement, a time bomb ticking quietly beneath the veneer of security. The Harper's journey, though singular, reflected a broader truth: stability is never guaranteed, and every promise, no matter how institutionalized, carries risk. Knowledge, preparation, and vigilance are as crucial as trust and hope. The cameras linger on Susan's paintings, the lines sharp, the shadows deep, the figures standing resolute amid crumbling towers. They are more than art, they are testimony, a reminder that survival demands courage and clarity, and that families who face crises together emerge resilient. As the screen fades to black, one truth remains: security, freedom, and dignity are never gifts, they are earned, defended, and remembered. And in the quiet determination of the Harper family, there is a lesson for every American: the time bomb may still tick, but awareness and unity can transform fear into endurance, and despair into hope.